Welcome all you Facebook viewers and YouTube viewers, and welcome to the Rush Hill Community Church. And I'm Pastor Bob. We are here tonight for our very first piece of evidence as we give evidence or the case of Jesus Christ's resurrection. And this is our very first piece of evidence that we're going to introduce in just a moment. One of my favorite television shows ever is the Andy Griffith Show. I love each and every one of the characters, Andy Griffith and Aunt Bee and Barney, and who doesn't love Golly Shazam? We loved every single one of them. And in fact, even some of the ones that weren't on very often were such good actors and very good. And one of those was a guy they called Asa. Do you remember who Asa was on the Andy Griffith Show? I'll give you a couple of minutes because some of you are going, oh, I know who that is. I'll give you 5 seconds. 1, 2, time's up. Asa was the security guard at the bank. You remember him now, don't you? The old man that sat in the corner, and he had his chair, and he was always asleep. Had his gun there, and Barney Fife thought it was just ridiculous how lightly he took his job. And every now and then he'd go up behind him and he'd go, "This is a stick-up!" And Asa would jump up and he'd drop his gun and it'd fall into pieces, and he'd get his pistol and the bullets would fall out. It was just a mess. But believe it or not, the piece of evidence that we're going to talk about today is about the security guards at Jesus' tomb 2,000 some years ago. You see, the religious leaders hated Jesus Christ. The Sanhedrin, from the very beginning of his ministry, they didn't like him, and they were jealous of him. And they tried everything they could to try to get rid of him. And the Bible tells us that they did all kinds of things and tried to get rid of him. And finally, as the Bible tells us, when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, even though Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. When they heard that Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead, they go, "Oh, we've got to do something now, because everybody's going to believe in him." So they decided to set a case against him. And they did. And they got him crucified. And Jesus died on that horrible cross. And he was put in the tomb, and they thought, and they were hoping they could just put this whole Jesus thing to sleep, but they were still terrified. Because they had heard Jesus say that in 3 days, once he died, in 3 days he would be resurrected and he would be alive again. Now, they didn't believe it. But they were scared to death that some of Jesus' disciples would sneak in there to that tomb and get the body, do something with it, and then claim he was resurrected and this Jesus thing would last forever. So, the Sanhedrin went to talk to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. And they asked him for a royal guard on the tomb. They explained the situation to him, and he agreed. So in Matthew 27, it's recorded that Pilate set the guard on the tomb. Now this is where it gets very interesting. This wasn't just one or two Asa-like guys that were old and sleepy, rusty swords and bent swords, but they were highly trained guards of the royal army. And they had been trained specifically to guard things. There was typically 12 of them. 16 of them. And the first 4 were on what they called the front lines of whatever was going to be guarded. And they were trained to be to guard just 6 feet apiece for the 4 of them. And then the other 12 would be behind them in a semicircle, laying down to sleep, because it was going to be a 24-hour guard. So they would take 4-hour shifts. Even those men that were sleeping would sleep with their hands out in front of them like this. So if someone tried to sneak through them or around them, they would step on their hands and wake them up. So if some of Jesus' disciples were wanting to steal his body away, they would have to get past the first 12. And they were heavily armed. Then they would have to get past the 4, also heavily armed. Now, I suppose this would be the easiest way to explain the disappearance of Jesus' body, but it certainly doesn't make any sense. It's actually one of the most absurd ways that they came up with for Jesus' disappearance. It's absurd that they would be able to go and just get to the tomb. So, our first piece of evidence that we're going to introduce into evidence is the professional guards that were guarding Jesus' tomb. I want to thank you for coming, this first segment and the first piece of information, the first evidence that we're going to do. The next one will probably be Monday around 7 again, this coming Monday. But I also want to encourage you to tune in Facebook and YouTube again Sunday morning at 9 o'clock for our regular worship service and the sermon. So again, thank you for coming, and we'll look forward to seeing you again Sunday and then Monday as we continue a case for Jesus' resurrection. Thank you.